Hello and welcome to the Elemental Digital Festival. Elemental is the community for professionals immersed in the world of heat, water, air and energy. We've got several discussions for you in play over the course of this festival. Now, I'm Dhruti Shah and I'm today's host for our session on clean and affordable options for social housing. Just a reminder, this is a CPD accredited session with these learning objectives. So by the end of this webinar, we aim to equip our attendees with an understanding of some of the potential heating solutions for social landlords, with a focus on heating systems that can help to reduce energy bills and tackle fuel poverty. So, we're in a cost of living crisis. Things aren't really getting easier. Liz Truss has announced plans to cap average household energy bills at £2,500, but critics say this doesn't go far enough. Heating our homes causes around 14% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. And last week, research from the Institute of Government revealed the UK was among the worst in Europe when it comes to energy efficiency and heat being wasted in homes. So, what can be done realistically to help reach net zero targets sooner rather than later and combat fuel poverty? I'd like to introduce you to our fantastic panelists who come with this massive range of expertise. We have Ian Preston, who's Director of Household Energy Services at the Centre for Sustainable Energy, Russell Smith, Managing Director of Parity Projects and founder of Retrofit Works, and Patrick Berry, Programme Director for Together Housing Energy Services and Technical Director of Together Net Zero, which is part of Together Housing Group. Finally, we have Mark MacArthur, who's from ECO, the Energy Company Obligation, so excited to see you, Mark, the Support Manager at the Energy Saving Trust. So, hello. And let's start with a question for you all. The fact is, we're in an energy crisis. It's becoming super important for social landlords to find ways to help keep their tenants out of fuel poverty. So I'd love for you to all to introduce yourselves a bit more than what I've just given and let us know what it is that you're all working on that assists with this. So let's start off with Ian. What's going on?
Thanks very much. So the Centre for Sustainable Energy, we are predominantly an advice agency. We give support and advice to householders. We do work with a couple of social landlords to deliver specific tenant-focused projects. We also support housing providers and others with energy efficiency retrofit. So we kind of can bring those two things together. And I guess where we see projects that have worked well, you have a combination of improving the fabric of the property, moving to a low carbon heating technology, but also you're giving advice and support to the householder so that they're maximising the kind of the performance of that. So, you know, clean and affordable heat, there's been a lot of talk of heat pumps recently, the move away from gas. And I suppose if you want that heat pump to perform well, you've got to bring a number of things together. So you need the installer who's going to configure that properly. You're going to do some work on the property to make sure it's ready for that technology, but you're also going to support the householder, because if you're going from a gas boiler, which works at a high temperature, to a heat pump, then you're not going to get the best from that system unless you actually support your tenant. So I guess that's what I'd kick off with.
Fantastic, thank you, Ian. So communication is especially key, it seems, as well. And Russell, how about you? If you'd be able to introduce yourself and also give us that idea of what you're working on right now.
Sure. Okay, hi. I'm Russell Smith, Managing Director of Parity Projects. We've been specialising in giving advice to people on that are engaged in a retrofit, either programme or individual renovation, for about 20 years now. Specifically trying to, over the last 10 years, develop tools to enable that to happen. So that service really got going when we were supporting social landlords from the asset management perspective as well as the energy perspective. I think landlords still have a little challenge trying to merge those two worlds, trying to reduce energy consumption and carbon emissions and understand the life of individual assets across a large number of houses is a complex area. So that's what we do. And we've got a tool called Portfolio, which allows landlords to log on to all of their own individual dwellings and see them at scale. And I think particularly from a cost of living crisis perspective, what it enables a landlord to do is to identify very easily the tenants that are most likely to be at risk this coming winter, and to know very quickly how best to tackle those properties, and then to build a programme hopefully that might align with existing funding that might be out there, whether it's Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund or ECO or LAD funding, and some of that is applicable to social landlords as well. But so my thing is really about the long-term plan and how to understand how to transform the stock over time, which works quite well, if you like, with what Ian does, which is about trying to give people advice immediately when they're most in need. I'm trying to help landlords, trying to make sure we don't get in this situation again, and that can be about just having good planning, resources in the right place, and people that most need.
Brilliant. So good planning is super key, and there's also a lot of synergy that we're seeing emerge already. And how about you, Mark? What is it that you're up to at the moment? And again, please give us a little bit more information about yourself and how you got into this.
Yeah, I work for the Energy Saving Trust. I've been there for about 15 years, and I had a local authority background before that as well, working in social housing. Energy Saving Trust is a non-profit distributing company that aims to promote net zero.
I'm just going to interrupt for 1 second, Mark, if that's all right. Are you all right to speak a little bit louder, just because it's a little bit quiet at the moment?
All right.
Brilliant.
The Energy Saving Trust is a non-profit distributing company which aims to promote net zero. My role is Eco Support Manager, Eco being the energy company obligation. So my role is really to promote energy company obligation activity in Scotland. I support the Home Energy Scotland network, which gives advice to householders, making sure they're up to date on all the various funding schemes that are available. And I have a specific focus on supporting local authorities and local and RSLs around energy efficiency improvement. I'm also a member of the Zero Emissions and Social Housing Task Force in Scotland, which is looking at the energy efficiency standard for social housing and looking at setting appropriate targets for that and trying to take into account all the various implications of investing in energy efficiency. What's the best routes to do that, and what's the implications for tenants of carrying out these improvements? So generally I'm giving support to local authorities, ourselves, Home Energy Scotland. My experience is pretty much focused in Scotland, so there may be certain lessons that from Scotland that might be relevant to England as well. So, but that's really what I'm involved in.
Fantastic. So it feels like you can't do these things in isolation when you're talking about social housing, or you're talking about energy generally. It feels like there are a lot of different conversations going on from the different elements that you're involved with. So thank you very much, Mark. And okay, now finally we're on to Patrick. If you're again able to tell us a little bit more information about who you are and also what you're up to in terms of the projects that you're currently involved with. Thank you.
Okay, I'm the director at Together Housing, responsible for delivering our net zero ambitions, and we've got a fairly ambitious strategy for our 37,000 properties across the north of England, and that includes things like taking gas out by 2035 as an ambition, because we can't decarbonise our stock while gas is still in there, and that's a pretty major challenge in all kinds of ways. And I think it strikes me, about the fuel crisis question is that we've all spent a lot of time looking at data and trying to understand our stock in many different ways, so we understand what we need to do and where we need to do it, and that's on a kind of time scale that's quite long, and doing that process moves quite slowly and is very involved, and takes a lot of time to mobilize in terms of getting the investment into our properties, and the fuel crisis has moved very quickly. And it's gone alongside much higher rates of inflation that have moved very quickly. And our ability to adjust that programme to fit with what's happening in the real world is actually quite difficult. And the level of impact we can have over a short period of time is also limited. So what we're doing in terms of that crisis is necessary, but probably not sufficient. And so it's a major challenge for us as a social landlord, and we can do all the things around helping people with financial management support and debt management and signposting to all the various things that go around. But again, that's probably not going to really dent the real challenges that face us over the next 6 months, because although the price has been capped, it's still at historically enormous prices for energy. And it really is going to affect people and affect some of the messaging we have around things like heat pumps, but there's still a lot of uncertainty around their use and their impact on bills. So we're putting a lot of efforts into our communications strategy with tenants and making sure that we are able to have a serious conversation around that. It means that our due diligence, if you will, on where and how we install heat pumps and the associated installations are such that if it doesn't work, then we're not going to do it. We can't be doing things that are going to make the tenant worse off. And there are some properties that it's just really hard to do, and we'll have to think about something different. And I think we'll probably get some things out in the conversation as we go on about the options we have around changing heating systems which help us decarbonise and address fuel poverty, and where renewable heat in the form of heat pumps is not suitable in due course. So yeah, it's a real challenge for us. And just one final point, which is about some of our communal heating systems where the tenants are not protected by the price cap. So we've seen a 400% increase in our heating costs for those properties. So someone who was paying £30 a month for their communal gas would now be paying £120 a month for the same gas, which is a kind of an unsustainable position for those people. So in the short term, we have to subsidise that. But it's clearly not sustainable for us to do that over the long term either. So it puts a lot of pressure on how we think about our communal heating systems and the efficiency of those systems, which in the main is very poor. So it's it changes some of the emphasis for us and some of the focus on which we have to try and target our resources.
So there's a lot of elements that are actually being rooted in the reality of what's going on. So there is, although planning for the future is really, really important, actually, how does that correspond with the fact that we have challenges right now, right here? So that's really, really important for us to also know. I'm seeing that questions are coming in, so I'm taking note. But Patrick, I'm just going to stay with you for 1 second, because I think this is quite key for all of us right now. Language. There's a massive challenge around language and understanding in the field. So just for the first instance, can you just explain what's the difference between addressing carbon in housing stock and addressing fuel poverty? Like, what makes these two different things, or are they the same actually? Can you tell us more?
Well, I think there's a large degree of overlap, but they're not necessarily the same. I've talked about taking gas out of our properties. That's part of our longer term strategy on the basis that as and when, and I suppose to some degree if, the electricity grid itself decarbonises and our stock is effectively electrified in terms of its heat and power, then the carbon impact of our stock, which is the major carbon impact of our business, will be negated or very severely reduced. But of course, in taking gas out of our properties, we have to put something in that works effectively. Otherwise, we not only disadvantage our tenants, but we also affect their ability to pay their bill in due course, which is the root of our business. So the challenge is then about how can we put something in which reduces the heat load on those properties overall, by the investment we make in that in each individual property in a fabric first approach, so we're delivering a kind of triple bottom line really in terms of providing benefits for the tenants of their heating bills, certainly no worse but hopefully lower, and where we are underpinning our own business and the ability of tenants to pay rent, which is challenged in the cost of living crisis, and we have significant long-term reductions in the carbon impact of our stock. So yeah, I see it as a strong overlap, and I think there is sometimes a lot of language used around this which confuses the two and overlaps them in a way which is sometimes not helpful.
Okay, so all of you, if there are any links or anything around language that would be useful for our audience, please don't hesitate to let us know or to put them into the chat. But I'm just going to go to Ian, who'd also spoken about communications earlier as well, in terms of right now, what can organisations and individuals do to make sure that the work that they're embarking upon is actually up to scratch and scalable, bearing in mind we have this cost of living crisis and there are the short-term focuses. Where can they find advice, and what should they actually avoid?
Well, I think we're in an unprecedented situation with the way bills are. I mean, I saw a question, I think, in the chat around the impacts of the price rises. We're looking at a situation where, on the old definition of fuel poverty was when you spent 10% of your income on your fuel. I think we're in a situation when bills were on average projected to be around 2,000, that a huge amount of households in this country, over half, would be in fuel poverty on old money. So then if you look at severe fuel poverty, which we used to call when you spend 20% of your bill on fuel, that's the vast majority of low-income households. So the bill's being capped at 2,500. So the situation is probably above that. I think the narrative has shifted in the press because there was talk of bills being £4,000, £5,000. Now the government's capped it at 2.5. The narrative seems to be that a favour has been done, but for many tenants, their incomes are lower. People in social housing have lower incomes. So, I think fuel poverty, the stats wise, we're looking at probably many tenants being in severe fuel poverty. So in terms of our sort of advice and the narrative and the sort of language used, I think we have to be mindful of people's situations and kind of not try and give them advice that's unrealistic. So for the first time ever, we'll be producing a fact sheet which is telling people how to keep themselves warm, how to optimally heat themselves and a room rather than heat their home. And for an energy advice agency who's always prided themselves on telling people to heat their homes to a sensible temperature, I think we're in an unprecedented situation. So I think in part we've got to be realistic about where people are at. For housing providers, we don't, obviously, I'm not in that situation. I mean, Patrick might be able to comment, but there's got to be some concerns around the repair of the property, mold and damp, because if you're not fully heating your home and you don't adequately ventilate those damp areas, you're going to get into problems because you're going to get even worse damp and mold problems. And a lot of the work we do with housing providers tends to be a housing officer will have referred someone to us, they've got a damp and mold problem. The tenant says it's the property, but actually when you look at how they're living in the home, quite often there's a huge amount can be done to minimise the damp issues. I know it's slightly off the topic of clean and affordable heat solutions, but that's. And another question in the chat was around hydrogen. So just coming up on that, I think CSE's view is that hydrogen is a bit of a unicorn as a heating technology. It's an extremely valuable fuel. It costs a lot to produce, and there are quite a few industrial and commercial applications for hydrogen, which will come first. We would have to find a way of manufacturing a lot more hydrogen at a lower value for it to start going into domestic properties. That's my view anyway.
Yeah,
Well,
if I could add that to that, Dhruti, I would agree with everything that was said about the impact of how people are going to heat their properties going forward, and it does cause us problems with damp and also disrepair claims, because there are various legal firms chasing disrepair claims on the back of damp, which cost us about £1 million in legal fees last year. And many of these are caused by people not using the heating systems properly. But the reality is that people will be likely to turn those heating systems off over the winter. As it stands, we have people who want to have their gas systems capped, and so they're not heating the property, or indeed looking after themselves in that sense, and so it causes problems right across the piece. And there's no easy silver bullet solution to these things at the current time. And so the range of advice, as was talked about there, about how to navigate that difficult period over the winter is probably going to be crucial. And just on a hydrogen point, again, concur completely. I think we're miles off having hydrogen for domestic properties. When you think about the relatively zero capacity to produce green hydrogen in the UK at the moment, to have enough to feed a domestic environment for consumers is at least a generation off. It may play a part in the future, but we can't sit around and wait for it, much as my gas team would like us to.
And Mark and Russell, I'd quite like to hear from you both on that as well. So Mark, if we come to you, but also can I just make sure your mic's up to your mouth so we can hear you correctly? We need to hear you. What's your response on both those points? Because the audience is particularly interested in the impact over the coming months and the fact that we've got so much going on to contextualise what's happening. What would you be saying to our audience right now, having heard your colleagues there?
Certainly in terms of fuel prices, I think going forward, prices are likely to be quite high. I was looking at projections into the 2030s, and probably the cost of gas might not be much lower than it is now. And who knows how the Ukraine situation is going to pan out. Also, the switch from using gas to produce electricity and more nuclear power coming on stream, and relatively cheap renewables maybe coming on stream as well. It's difficult to see how the relative prices of gas and electricity are going to change over time. I think probably if electricity decouples from being priced based on the gas market, then you might possibly see the price of electricity coming down relative to gas. As for hydrogen, certainly the gas distribution network companies, they are sort of looking very closely at how they could actually get hydrogen into the grids. This is quite pressing in Scotland, where from 2030 you won't be able to put in a boiler that's not hydrogen ready. I think they're talking very quickly about trying to remove gas from the network. So yeah, I think hydrogen is going to be very expensive. I mean, even the efficiency of using electrolysis to produce it from wind farms, for example, it's quite a wasteful process. There's a lot of waste heat comes out from it. So that's maybe an opportunity. You've got community heating close to where they're doing the electrolysis, I suppose. But I think hydrogen is going to be kind of difficult, very expensive, and I think it'll probably leave gas even more expensive than it is just now if you're going for a hydrogen network. So I don't think hydrogen is going to be the way forward. It may be parts in maybe local settings where it's cheap to do so, but I don't think you'll have a national hydrogen network going well into the 2030s.
And Russell, can I get you to step in on that in terms of, again, we've mentioned there's no silver bullet. There seems to be a lot of questions about what can actually be happening. What's your take on that right now?
Yeah, we need a national retrofit strategy, basically. We need a holistic view that is backed by a politician with a spine. That actually means we've got a long-term plan that the entire industry can get behind. It knows each company, each organisation, each advice centre can invest in itself, know what's coming down the track. It can actually get forward. If you can imagine what we would have done with the 130 billion that's going to be pumped into energy bills over this winter, if we'd have had that for the last 5 years, you'd have a whole bunch of people with very minimal bills. Even now, with energy prices high, the bills would still be low because they don't need to heat their house. Now, of course, we can't afford to get to passive house standards on retrofit. A lot of people in the chat, they're saying fabric first is the right approach. Absolutely, but you've got to look at each individual building in the round. It might well be that a heat pump is the cheapest, most effective way of getting that house down to zero carbon and to lower bills. But if it hasn't had the energy efficiency sorted, the fabric measures sorted first, the bills will go up. So you've got to look at each individual building on its own basis. This is a mass customization problem. And it's that the process needs to start very early on. You look at the entire stock of a housing association or a geographical area on behalf of a local authority. And then you take a view on what the best thing is to get that entire stock down to low energy bills, low carbon emissions, and you break it up into manageable chunks. Think about how you'll do that over a period of years and invest in the supply chain to get that done, because quite frankly, we don't have anywhere near the number of people working in our industry to get this work done either. That in itself is a good reason to have a national retrofit strategy so that people will be enfranchised to build up the workforce, actually get the colleges that can actually train people on this stuff, because they can't right now. All of that stuff needs to change. But frankly, all we're doing right now is just playing around the edges.
Russell, just add to that. I think one of the issues with the supply chain is the government's played stop-start with retrofit investment over a period of 10, 12 years. And so the signals to the market have been offered and then removed. And there's a lack of, I think, faith in certainly the smaller private sector who's had their hands burnt in training people in the past. And they want to see a real market taking place. And so we have a slight chicken and egg situation where people aren't investing because they don't think the supply chain's there, and not putting real contracts into the market, which will be the signals to the market to actually think, well, this is real, it's sustainable, it's going to happen, and we need to invest in the resources in our business, our college, or whatever it happens to be. So it's all a bit of a mess, frankly.
I was actually going to ask about bridging those, the current skills gap that's in play, but I think you're there. But I must say, right now, we are getting a lot of questions in. So clearly this is getting people very, very interested. So I'm just going to actually go to a couple of them from the audience right now. I mean, there's one from, is it Risa? I hope I pronounced that correctly, saying what about the added hidden costs for electrification of heat, such as grid upgrades or even consumer unit upgrades for the properties to be able to adopt electric heating. This never seems to be discussed on these panels. The grid capacity for electric needs to increase massively to meet peak heat demand. Are you able to sort of comment on that? I mean, I'll go, Ian, I'll go with you first, and then I'd like to hear from the rest of you as well on that, because I don't want us to say we don't talk about this on the panels. Here you go.
Yeah, sure. So we're currently involved in the Bristol Heat Pump Ready programme, which is a BEIS thing to accelerate heat pumps in a concentrated area. The idea is to get 25% of homes on a feeder or substation signed up to have a heat pump next year. So in a conversation with WPD, Western Power Distribution, who's the network operator for this area, I asked them, how much do you care at the moment about how efficient that home is for that heat pump, what the coefficient performance is, and whether there's kind of, you're going to get hit with the costs of potentially network upgrades because of the phase of supply or the local area. And they said, well, at the moment, as a network operator, we're not too concerned about the COP, and they're going in at relatively low volumes. So yes, there are often these kind of hidden costs, but it's small numbers. If they're going in at high volumes, WPD and that consumer, this will become apparent quite quickly. So it becomes another barrier, which will put people off. That a lot of the units now aren't three-phase heat pumps, that is. So, they are more deployable than they used to be. So you do get less of this, but yeah, plenty of properties will need upgrades. And the other thing is, if they're getting deployed in high volume, the network operators are going to really care about the coefficient of performance. And I think currently the operating average is 2.4 in this country for a heat pump coefficient performance. You're not unlikely to see your bill go down if it's below 3. So we're going to be wanting heat pumps with a coefficient performance of nearer 4. And when you speak to installers at the beginning of a project, they always give it the chat, and they're always saying that, oh yeah, you'll get 4, but the actual measured performance is often lower. And that comes down to a combination of the fabric, as Russell described, but also how that is, how it's configured, the size of radiators, the size of the pipework, what the design temperatures, all of that sort of stuff. So as well as all the sort of fabric side, we need heating engineers who are moving across the heat pumps and the existing heat pump installers to have a much better sort of understanding, benchmark of knowledge. I sort of answered the question about the network operator, but more at the sort of global scale. But I mean, I think they're aware of the issues, but until they're going in large volumes, I think the network operators aren't too concerned. They're sort of planning for it, but mass take up, they'll do more about it, obviously.
Yeah, if I may add to that, actually, we've got a similar project in Leeds on the Heat Pump Ready programme, and our plan is to overlay individual capacity data onto our demand modelling, so that we can start to identify areas of the grid in a much more granular way that might be reaching capacity if we run a scenario in our software that deploys heat pumps at scale. I think that's really the only way to sort of call out the network operators on that, really, because we can tell them they will have a problem if you've got a plan to deploy. At the moment, their model really is somebody gives them a call and says, we're going to need lots of electricity, and they say, oh, we can't cope with that. Here's a bill for 27 million quid. And right now, that's a very immature way of running a business. I think they're waiting for the demand so that they can raise the money or go whinging to government to give them the money to get it done. But actually, all of that stuff, it puts up barriers that might slow things down by 5 years. And in the face of man-made climate change, as well as unbelievable energy prices, we can't be behaving like that. So the DNO's really getting to get on the case. And if you've got a model that allows you to align demand with a grid capacity, you can actually mitigate that demand in the first place. If you are installing insulation before the heat pump, you need a smaller heat pump that needs electricity, lower draw, and the COP, as Ian says, will be higher. So we just don't have a mature way of planning our way out of any of these problems.
Yeah, Dhruti, could I just add to that from a again on the ground perspective, really? So we have been trying to install heat pumps at a fairly large scale on whole estates and so on. And the DNOs, I think it's fair to say, and by their own admission, are not configured to deal with those applications at scale. The major problems they have generally not been about the capacity of the network, but where we have a lot of properties which are looped, so one supply serves two properties, and their ability to mobilize contractors to deloop those properties to enable heat pumps to be installed means that investment programs are severely delayed over a long period of time. And that's even if the DNOs are offering to pay for that. That varies from DNO to DNO in terms of policy. And going back to Russell's point, what I think is essential for the social housing sector is that we are organised and have a strategic relationship with DNOs to be able to say, okay, over the next 3 to 5 years, these are our plans for installing heat pumps in these localities. You need to start working with us to manage how that is going to affect the capacity of the grid, so we can work together either to mitigate it, plan it, strengthen it where it's required in advance of the installations, etc. Those strategic relationships, by and large, don't exist, and certainly the role of combined authorities, which we're certainly trying to do in West Yorkshire, for example, is, I think, going to be key.
Okay. Mark, can I get you on this? Because also we've got a comment from Ian Preston in the chat saying we need DNOs to be much more open with their data to enable us to do the modelling. So in that respect, what's your experience and what would you like to add to this?
Yeah, certainly in Scotland it's pretty much the same sort of situation, that the DNOs aren't very sort of helpful. Quite often you get big projects being delayed because they can't upgrade the capacity in time, and there's very high costs associated with that. I think the whole heating and distribution industry has probably got its head slightly on the ground, because the government's talking about a 30-fold increase in the installation of heat pumps, and the impact of that on the distribution network is going to be massive. It's one of the things we're looking at with the Zero Emissions and Social Housing Task Force in Scotland. We're looking at how these programmes are progressing and what sort of conversations we need to have with the distribution network to make that happen. So, yeah, I think there's no sort of solution other than maybe government has to sort of kind of force them or regulate for them to be more responsive. But yeah, certainly we're certainly seeing delays and very high costs associated with installing heat pumps.
Okay. I mean, I've seen a comment and question from Andy in the chat saying, okay, 63% of Danish homes are on district heating, which can now be supplied by big heat pumps powered by wind energy. Have we missed the boat? Have we missed the boat? Is there hope for us? Who wants to step up and answer that?
I think there's always hope. Yeah, I mean, I think with the expansion of renewables, in Scotland, probably most of the domestic electricity is covered by renewables on average. We also have spare nuclear capacity as well. So I think with the expansion of wind farms, etc., especially on land, there'll be opportunities there for spare heat production, etc. And I think heat pumps are going to be quite important, because you're looking at the demand on the electricity network. Heat pumps do have a sort of multiplication factor. So if you just went with radiant heat, 100% efficiency, obviously heat pumps are better because you've got an 100% aspiration to get 100% efficiency out of that. So I think heat pumps are going to be quite important. And I think the Scottish setup, where you've got like 35% of properties are flatted, the idea of like communal heat pumps is probably quite attractive. And if these can be fed by cheaper renewables, then that's maybe a way forward. But I don't think we've missed the boat, but it would be a massive change. I think every whole sort of heat distribution production has to change going forward.
Okay. And Patrick, how's the boat going on your side?
In terms of heat networks, heat networks are complicated, and we probably have more opportunities to do with that with our new build than we have to do with our retrofit. But part of the challenge is having the base load to support a heat network. So we've had conversations with the local authorities in our patches who have been trying to work with government on producing heat networks, particularly around the town centres and beyond. And all of those have found it extremely difficult to have something which stacks up both in terms of the heat demand patterns, but also the costs of developing and installing that. So it's pretty challenging. I mean, our focus on heat networks is much more based on our communal heat networks and how we make those efficient for our tenants going forward, rather than those larger scale ones at this time.
One thing I could add So one thing I could add to that, in Scotland we have a local heat and energy efficiency strategy. Each local authority has been tasked with trying to identify where you could get common heating in place, where there's sort of mixed use, etc., to make that more efficient. So that will lead to various plans to try and strategically develop community heating networks and try and identify the potential for that.
The comments come in. I just want to make sure that that we can get it clarified. From Ian, just saying continuous ventilation should mitigate properties being unheated? ? How can someone respond to that? Can it?
I can if you like. I mean, considering any fabric upgrade without installing good ventilation is making that property much worse and the tenant's life much harder. It's an absolute no-brainer. PAS 2035 is a standard which is now overarching quite a lot of the funded work in the UK. It forces that into the decision making, and particularly in terms of ventilation assessment at the start and designing ventilation property. I bet your bottom dollar there isn't any ventilation contractor out there that does a design unless they're installing something like MVHR or something much more powerful on that sort of side of things. Installing extract vents into a home where there is no air coming in means those extract vents are doing nothing at all. It's like putting your thumb over a straw once you put it into a glass of Coke and nothing comes out. Extract vents do nothing if you haven't followed a proper strategy for ventilating that property. So it goes hand in hand with the comment earlier on about underheated homes suddenly having massive mold and problems over time. The maintenance issues that are going to come out of this winter will be horrendous, and a lot of that will be down to poor ventilation. So it's an absolutely essential part of this. Energy, water, ventilation, they're all important elements of the system of the house.
And there's another comment I get, another question actually I quite like to understand, that's come from Lucy Alice in terms of, is there any consideration of embodied emissions in any of your approaches? So in respect to that, I'm going to go with Ian first, if that's all right. Like how can we answer that?
Can you just run me through the question again?
Sure.
Lucy's question, I'm looking for it in the chat.
Is there any consideration, it's come through to me on questions, so I'll just double check, but is there any consideration of embodied emissions in any of your approaches?
Oh, yeah, embodied emissions is something that is really not very well understood, or really, it's rarely accounted for, I think, in most construction projects, typically. I think we have, obviously, where you've got a property that's sort of vapor open and is, older construction, we would be recommending that potentially someone has like wood fiber insulation materials, for example, which have got lower, obviously, embodied energy than their kind of plastic alternatives. But typically it's not a component of the grant funded work. And now with the social housing decarbonisation fund, a lot of that is, a lot of work will be driven by that. And, as with all kind of large grant funded programs, it's quite cost driven. Government doesn't seem to appreciate quality or materials. The bottom line is always, a factor in procurement. Procurement exercises are run, cost is probably 80% sometimes, and if you're going on cost as your major kind of lead for procurement, you're not going to be getting higher cost materials that got lower embodied energy, I suppose, would be my sort of cynical view of the way it all works.
Anyone else want to jump in on that? Otherwise I can go. There are actually quite a couple of questions on solar PVT, so go ahead.
Yeah, this has been looked at in Scotland through the energy efficiency standard for social housing. There's a current review going on. It's going to look at embodied energy of the various options to try and improve the stock. So that is being researched at the moment, and we're trying to look at the cost effectiveness of going for a more holistic and low carbon solution.
Okay, that's helpful. So just going into the solar PV in terms of, there are two questions, so I'm going to ask them and see if they come together. And one was actually to Patrick from Raman in terms of, if you're planning to remove gas, it means more electricity will be used. Are you thinking of solar PV installations and any other technology to bring benefits to households? And then there's a more general one for everyone in terms of Paul saying, I would like to know if there's a way of speeding up the DNO for volume solar installs rather than the 28 days post install for one property, the increased number within 500 meters radius before install radius before installs can be done. So I guess the question is, what more can be done around these solar PV installations and any other innovation, and how can we do it at a faster scale?
Yeah, okay, yes, so the answer is yes. I spent the last 2 or 3 years trying to develop a commercial investment model for solar PV and battery systems that would pay for itself over the longer term. I mean, social housing practitioners are in the basis of patient capital. So we can put these things on as I would say, a permanent asset, renewable power generating asset on our property. And the model that we've developed will be working with what's called a peer-to-peer exchange. And the idea is that we would be able to produce power, all of the power coming to a property, which was significantly below the price of the current price cap, but have multiple revenue streams which allowed us to pay for that solar PV investment over time. So we're just trying to finalise legals on that, but we do have a fairly ambitious programme, all of the things being equal, to try and get to 50 megawatts of power across our stock by 2035, and effectively to try and support that transition to electrification of heat in our properties. I think I'm speaking at a smart housing conference in October about that in Manchester, if anyone's interested. The other thing was that we see a big difference in the DNOs around solar PV consents for multiple installations. With the Electricity Northwest, which is a large part of our stock, we can connect and notify. They are happy for us to do that, given their experience of what happened with the feed-in tariff and the impact of that on the network. But we have an ongoing conversation with them on a strategic basis, which has helped. Elsewhere, Northern Power Grid, we still have to jump through an awful lot of hoops to justify installing solar PV and battery systems, and that is a barrier to us actually progressing that, and that's an ongoing conversation.
And are there any other with the others also? Are there any other innovations that that our audience should be aware of, just to sort of keep an eye on as well? That's coming up.
I suppose with PV, the thing is that households are not always able to use the electricity that's produced. So trying to find ways that they can actually make use of the electricity being produced, and also look at the storage of electricity as well, battery storage. That's maybe the jury's out in the cost effectiveness of that. Yeah. So I think there's a bit of investigation into how to make that work, and advice to tenants as well.
Okay, and anything else? Otherwise, I'll go on, because there's a really interesting question as well. And feel free to keep adding to the chat. Where actually, Russell, Kevin asks, is there a construction body that should sit over the top of the planning requirement bracket strategy, or is that the job of the government? So where are we at in terms of who's in charge of what?
Yeah, there really should be. And Jacob Rees-Mogg's not going to do it, is he? So we need something in place. Government aren't going to grab this one at all, in my view, before the next election. So we need something, and I'm in discussions with a few combined authorities and different parts of the industry to be able to come up with something. And now creating a new organisation always makes people shiver. We don't want to do that, but we need some kind of mechanism to reach consensus on what good looks like and how we move forward together. And I'm working on that with the Construction Leadership Council and the Green Construction Board.
So there are lots of conversations going on at the moment, which is really, really important. And on that respect, as I said, the questions just don't stop. Patrick, have you had issues with needing to upgrade electrical boards within your properties to move to heat pumps? And that's from Reese again. Adding, importantly, the RCBO protection required for most inverter-driven heat pumps. I think that's a good question. So any issues?
Not that I'm aware of, but I might not be close enough to it to answer that question specifically. But by and large, all of our properties have had electrical upgrades over the past 5 years, which has probably reduced issues associated with that. So thus far, it doesn't appear to have been an issue.
Okay. Air to air. So the air to air is being discussed quite a lot in the comments in terms of air to air heat pumps and the potential role of them. What's all your takes on that? So I'm going to go with you, Ian, if that's all right first.
So I mean, if you go into a pub or Tesco's Express or commercial buildings, air to air is often used. It's just not used in a domestic setting, and I think it does have a lot of potential, and it's not really been explored. In fact, it's only been something that we've been talking about internally only recently, really, last couple of months, we've had some discussions about air-to-air, where it might be suitable. I think we were thinking smaller properties, but in a recent workshop, I was reminded by a heating engineer that air-to-air is used commercially at a much larger scale. So yeah, I do think it's got potential, and obviously then you haven't got the same issues with the distribution system potentially. So I can't say I'm an expert, but I do think it's got potential.
That's all good. And I mean, we're talking about sort of different types of solutions, I guess, ideas. Infrared, again, that's also being discussed a couple of times in the chat. So what can we talk about this? He's put a comment, not a question, saying infrared is not properly recognized by SAP as treated as direct acting electric heating, same as panel heaters. So he also mentions that he thinks that air-to-air heat pumps are also not properly recognized. So infrared, can we talk a little bit more about that in terms of how feasible is that as a clean and affordable heat option for social landlords? Who would like to step up on that one? Who's got experience?
Happy to say so. I mean, from our point of view, I'd like to be more interested in it, but there are two factors which currently prevent that, and as evaluation criteria change behaviour, well, one of the key things we're tasked with is achieving EPC by 2030, and as the question suggests, infrared is not currently recognised by SAP, so that kind of works against us on that. We have piloted it, particularly in some difficult heat properties, and it's worked very well, particularly a new form of infrared. We were helping a new tech business develop. But the challenge on top of that is always what do you do with the hot water, and how you find a way to make that both affordable, usable, or potentially renewable for the tenant, and a combination of the two. Well, at the moment, it would still be direct in most cases as a retrofit, as a hot water tank with an immersion in it. There are new products driven by heat pumps, smaller heat pumps that sit on the tank in the market, but they seem to be largely focused on new build rather than retrofits. So there's a space there, and if you could combine the two, it might get interesting. But if the government, BRE and others can address the issue of SAP around infrared, that will also, I think, make people look differently at the solution.
And there are links being put in, by the way, everyone, in the chat, highlighting different solutions, different options. The whole point is for this to be an educational seminar as well as a conversation. So do keep looking in there. Just seeing that Dr. Marcus William, sorry, the rest of your name doesn't come up. I apologize. Saying that there are other links there as well. But also that's quite interesting. Very practical question here, and from Andy. Should we be turning combi boiler flow temperatures down to save this winter, or turn the room thermostat down to 15 degrees Celsius to keep homes drier? And I'm sure that's something that a lot of tenants would also want to be aware of. So in that respect, Russell, throw something in there.
Well, actually, I'm going to say no. I'm not going to answer that because I don't give energy advice to tenants. That's Ian's job.
Ian should step in.
What's your standard approach there, Ian? Because I'd quite like to know myself.
Well, we sort of had several long meetings in preparation for this winter where we've got the whole advice team together to discuss what advice we're giving so that we can obviously get some content on the website for those that use the internet, and what's practical. So I don't think we've bottomed out what we're going to do yet, because effectively, if you're saying to people, okay, just heat yourself or one room, we've got to say something about the rest of the property. So just ventilating it is not going to be enough. You will need to put some heat into it. Otherwise, you just you're still going to get damp issues. And we don't have a scientific answer really, other than suggestions of making sure you heat your property fully for once a week, or run it as a lower temperature as you can. I think that's the direction we're going in really, which is pretty depressing. But so I think it will be as much. If you're really going to confine yourself to one room, then we'll be saying as much ventilation as property, and then as much heat as you can do in the remaining space, or just for a very limited time once a week, try and get good heat throughout the property.
Okay.
That's helpful. And just we are sort of coming towards the end, so I will try and get as many questions in while we've got these amazing experts here. One question from Kevin, who says that he's not a journalist, is are social housing bodies guaranteeing all properties will be heated through the winter, and how they plan to deal with the cost issue? What's your knowledge of that right now? Who would like to step in on that one?
Well, I can speak. We can't guarantee that because it's not in our gift to guarantee it. It's in the control of tenants who face all the challenges that we've talked about today. So we'll be in a similar position that Ian has just described, really, in having to try and offer advice for people to deal with that as best they can. It does raise another issue for electric heating systems, which is depending on the type of tank. Some of the systems have an automated flush of the hot water tank to deal with Legionella. And if the systems are switched off, then clearly that's not going to happen either. So that creates another liability risk, which is also a challenge. So the shape of that advice going forward is pretty critical. But again, we're not in a position to make those guarantees.
Okay, that's fair enough. And I think this will probably be coming towards the end of other questions. And then I'd love to have a key takeaway message from each of you in terms of Ian's asking how much Eco4 is being used in social. What does that mean?
Energy company obligation. So it's only available to EF and G rated properties, and possibly some D rated if it's an innovative measure. So I'd imagine there's not many EF and Gs left in any parts of the UK or Great Britain. So it's very limited potential, I think.
Yeah, certainly from a social housing perspective, a lot of the worst properties have been done. And our experience with the housing providers we work with is that the ones that are still left that are F and G, I think housing providers know about, and quite often you'll find that there's a tenant in that property who potentially has refused multiple attempts in the past to improve their home because for whatever reason, they don't want it. I've heard all sorts. I trust the coal man, for example. I think in this modern day and age, that maybe not that unsensible comment on the industry, but so yeah, probably quite limited, really. But and for those who've picked it up, BEIS have said that PV can be classified as a heating measure under Eco4, and we've gave them some comment on that, but they're happy with their fudge.
Okay, so look that up, people. So as we're coming towards the end of time, and I want to make sure that people know where to find you and everything. Each of you, if you can give us one key takeaway that you would like for the audience to hear from you, please can you let us know? So I'd like to go to you, Russell, first. Like, what is so super important for them to be aware of?
That there's help. I think they're not in this on their own. I know different landlords have different resource available, but there are always organisations like Ian's around that can be a third party that can give energy advice as well. I think that's the key thing. And energy companies as well are actually being pretty good at supporting their customers right now. But one thing I would say is the last thing you want to do is just stop paying. You want to be able to have a conversation before you stop paying. If that's the only situation you're in, you've got to have a plan, and energy companies will help on that basis. Yeah, that's my 2 pence.
That's fantastic. And Mark, how about you?
Probably planning for decarbonisation. There's going to be significant costs involved in that, and the impacts of that on tenants. For example, might impact on rents, for example. Also running costs as well will be impacted if you're putting in heat pumps versus gas, and we've not really seen how the costs are going to sort of fall between electricity and gas. So I think planning the optimal solutions and paying a lot of attention to that. And there are tools that maybe can help with that. And yes, we have the home analytics tool, which helps local authorities and ourselves look at stock to try and optimise solutions.
Patrick?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question, actually. To put it into 2 bits, really. One is, I think, to don't stall in terms of your investment in your properties. Push on and start to make that investment, because particularly in the fabric of the properties and subsequently the heating solutions, because that's what's going to make the difference. But the other big for me is really focus on the communications with your tenants and understanding of their position, and combine that with the ability to gather actual data about how they are consuming or not consuming energy, and the kind of impacts that starts to have, because that needs to, I think, inform our ongoing response, because this is not a short-term blip, as it seems. It looks like it's going to be around for at least the next couple of years or so, and we'll have to be able to manage it.
Fantastic. And Ian, how about you? Oh, quiet. We need to hear that message.
Sorry, a classic muting. So yeah, I think the comments around planning are just very, very important. So we've done some work on the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund in terms of bid evaluation, a bit of work supporting housing providers to bid as well. And it's notable, you know, the people that have got their stock data, they've used some modelling software to look at what options are available. They've got a good asset manager who's obviously, you know, got a strategy, got board support and all the rest of it, you know. That's crucial. I think, you know, it takes time, and if you are thinking of bidding, don't just charge in either. You know, I'm hopeful that the decarbonisation fund is here to stay. You know, new government, we'll see what happens. But even if it got, you know, don't charge in and try and get a bid in just because you can. There's some money there. You know, if you do the work first, whatever you do will be better. I think it's mine.
So just to come to an end in terms of saying thank you so much to everyone who's joined, as well as our fantastic panel. We're actually going to be writing up a roundup of the key messages from today's session. So if you're not already, please do follow us on LinkedIn, on the Elemental website, for all of the latest updates. We're also we also have a social presence. This is a CPD accredited session, so do log those hours. Also, please note that the festival continues. So for more details for all the sessions, please do check out our website. We have 2 sessions tomorrow looking at the role of metrics in housing fit and models for whole house retrofit. So lots of data. And then further, there's a session on energy solutions as well. Just want to say thank you so much to our fantastic panelists. Ian Preston, Russell Smith, Patrick Berry and Mark MacArthur. You've been amazing. I've definitely learned a lot. I believe that our audience has as well. And yeah, I guess a key message of having hope and keep listening out for what seems to be an ever evolving situation. Thank you all.